Thank you to Sarah, Natalie, and Bill for the great introduction, and to Markel, Aon, and Abir for sponsoring this dive-in panel discussion on psychological safety. As Bill mentioned, my name's Adrian Hartnett-Beasley. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And to all those in our cyber audience today, welcome to you and thank you for joining us. I'll now introduce our esteemed panel. Latisha Lister-Burgess joined the Employee Assistance Program of Bermuda in 2012 and became the Executive Director in August 2018. Not only is Latisha well-credentialed both academically and professionally, she is currently the only certified employee assistance professional in Bermuda, having received this certification in 2015. Latisha's broad professional experience has led her to her current work at EAP Bermuda, which includes counseling, crisis management, creating and delivering of workshops, management consultations, and policy development. We're grateful for Latisha being here to share her professional advice on what it means to be psychologically safe in the workplace. Philip Vandoninck is the CEO of Fidelis Bermuda, a member of the Fidelis Group Executive Committee, and the chair of Fidelis's Group DEI Committee, as well as the chair of the Association of Bermuda International Companies DEI Committee. Philip is a Belgian national who spent time working in Brussels and London before arriving in Bermuda at the end of 2004. Establishing two new Bermuda offices, Hiscox in 2005 and Fidelis in 2015, Philip has personal experience of how important diversity is in recruitment. He has since become a strong advocate and voice in Bermuda for action to change the reinsurance industry's DEI practices. Tawana Tannock is the Managing Director of Skuld Bermuda Protection and Indemnity Association Bermuda and Vice President of the Board of Hydra Insurance Company. She is heavily involved in community and international business initiatives aimed at equity and inclusion and is a board member of ABIC with Philip, in addition to sitting on various scholarship committees. In 2014, Tawana started one of the first women's colleague resource groups in the Bermuda insurance industry, which would lead to her later involvement on the inaugural Dive-In Festival Organizing Committee. Tawana, a lawyer, is also passionate about human rights law and is the former chairperson of the Human Rights Commission in Bermuda. As HRC chairperson, Tawana established precedents outlining the responsibility of both employees and employers in creating workplaces free of discriminatory behavior and harassment. She also delivered a landmark judgment on behalf of the HRC and recommended legislative amendments which were subsequently passed by Parliament. Tawana is active in many community initiatives such as One Love Bermuda and is an outspoken advocate on domestic abuse reform. To all three of you, thank you in advance for being here and sharing with us today in this Dive-In panel. As we all know, the overarching theme of this year's Dive-In Festival is Braver Cultures. And our discussion today is going to dive in to psychological safety in the workplace. As usual, the Dive-In Festival is exciting and challenging. And when we were discussing what direction we were going to take on our panel, we agreed the importance of drawing out real-life examples and ensuring that our audience could take something practical away from our discussion. We'll be accepting questions in the chat at the end, and we'll have time for those near the end of our presentation. Latisha, Tawana, Phil, I'd love to let you share why you're doing this panel. Latisha, do you want to start?
So in our work at EAP, one of the things that we see often is the work between our physical working space and how emotionally safe it is for people in those spaces. And so after being at EAP all these years, I thought, why aren't we talking about creating spaces and definitively having plans so that people can show up as their whole self, but in a way that's safe, in a way that invites conversation, in a way that says bravery is making sure that all of us not just have a voice, but feel equipped to use it. So it's always my passion.
Great. Phil?
I think from a business standpoint, employees are our biggest assets we have available to us, and we only can maximize value for our employees and their career development if they can operate in a safe space. So it's very important for any business to provide that environment.
Excellent.
Yeah, so, Adrian, my answer, I guess, is twofold. And the first is that it's very important to me. I've spoken time and time again about DEI fatigue, which is when DEI events are performative without any real substance. And one of the ways in which DEI can have a negative impact is if DEI initiatives are conducted in a workspace that is not psychologically safe.
Absolutely.
So it was really important to me that we drive this conversation forward. And then also the other reason why it was really important for me to participate on this panel is because Sarah Randall, who asked me to participate, I always look to her as a great example of somebody who helped cultivate a safe space for me when I first entered the insurance industry. And also when I found out that you would be on the panel, I know what your belief system is, and I felt like this is somebody who, if there are concerns, they'd be taken care of. And then Natalie and I actually met, was it a year ago, 2 years ago, about a DEI issue. So I knew that when Sarah and Natalie said, this is something we want to do, that it wasn't just going to be performative. I knew that they were people who, in my opinion, had put skin in the game. So I said, just from that instance, not only the topic, the subject matter, but the very fact that I knew that there were people who were actively engaged in this process in moving this conversation forward, that made me excited to be a part of this initiative.
Yeah, that resonates with me. I think it's really important when we talk about DEI initiatives, creating braver cultures and psychological safety, the work that we do has to be intentional.
Yeah.
You know, it can't be performative. To get into this topic, I'd really like to, my debate background makes me ensure that we have to define what we're talking about so we all know what we're talking about. So the term psychological safety, what it means and what it doesn't mean. Latisha, you've worked extensively in this space. Can you share with us what we mean here by psychological safety?
So the term gets bandied around a lot, and I think sometimes we can talk about things without truly knowing what's happening. So I'm also a big one for definition. So I'm going to start with Amy Edmondson, who's done a lot of work in this field. And her belief is that psychological safety is a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes, and that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. So simply put, psychological safety or psychologically safe work environments are ones where people feel equipped to share their voices, feel that they are going to be supported when they raise their hand, and feel that it is safe to say, I'm not sure I understand this, I'm not sure I agree with this, I'm not sure we're going in the right direction. So it's really creating on an ongoing basis individual, where people feel individually responsible but also collectively responsible for making sure that everyone is heard and respected.
That's
so when
great.
we're talking about safety, it's for us individually but also collectively.
Yeah, I mean, psychological safety is a paramount thing to have everywhere in your life. We're today here talking about psychological safety in the workplace, so thank you for helping define that. I read something from the Center for Creative Leadership, and I'll just read it because I want to quote it. Psychological safety at work doesn't mean that everybody is nice all the time. It means that you embrace the conflict, you speak up, knowing that your team has your back and you have their backs. Is that true?
It's so important that we separate the two. Psychological safety is not everyone saying yes to something. In fact, some of the most unsafe environments I've worked at were where everyone felt like they could only survive by sharing the same opinion. And so that's not our goal here today. I don't want anyone to walk away thinking, as long as we're all nodding and as long as we're all agreeing, we're in a safe environment. Actually, what we're looking for is where people feel able to challenge discourse, where people feel able to say, I'm not sure we're heading in the right direction, where people feel able to speak up at meetings and know that just because I have a different opinion doesn't mean that I'll be shut down. And so when we're talking about psychological safety, we always have to be very critical around understanding that it is not niceness in the work environment, it is challenging discourse. But more than challenging discourse, it's challenging the ability for people to say, hey, I can be different and I can be authentic and it'll be celebrated. So not just allowed, but celebrated, expected, and be really encouraged in a work environment. So when we're talking about psychological safety, we have to talk about, are we creating the safety for people to share themselves?
That's great. That resonates with me a lot. You referenced having worked in psychologically unsafe places. Can you give an example of when you, maybe more than one, but one for now, and where you may have felt psychologically unsafe?
So
and how did it make you feel as well?
I remember working in, and again, so my background is mental health. So you would think that even in mental health, we're creating and knowing how to create spaces for people. But I remember one of my very first, job opportunities. I had this person I was working with, and I thought a lot of them, and they had some really great opinions and really strong opinions. And we went into our first team meeting, and I kind of raised my hand and gave a differing opinion, and was immediately shut down. And it was very clear in that moment that it was not okay to say something that differed to him. And what that taught me in that moment is we are not just saying on a one-off basis, hey, I want to hear what you think. We're also creating a space for everyone else to know what's safe to say in this moment. So I was very clear that in that environment, I could have one-on-one conversations with this person, but in a team setting, their voice was the only one that mattered. And so I immediately knew this is not psychologically safe for everyone. And so in fact, when I became a manager, that was the very first thing I used as the building block for making sure that my team looked and felt different.
And if I could just ask, so what were some of the things that you put in place to ensure that what you experienced wasn't experienced by other members of your team?
Great question. So one of the things that I did from the beginning was position myself as someone who wanted to know what you were thinking. So at every meeting, we always start off by, what are we getting right? What's happening? What's interrupting the work, personally or professionally? How are we hearing each other? How are we supporting each other? What are we not listening to? What am I not seeing? And so more than saying, hey, I'm available for your comments, because often that puts pressure on people to come forward with this mythical open door policy. I didn't want an open door policy. I wanted an open ear policy. And an open ear policy requires me to do the work that says, I'm here to listen to you. I'm going to show you that I'm a listener. I'm going to listen to what you have to say. I'm not going to shoot the messenger. And when things come up, I'm going to do something about it. I can't promise to fix everything, but I can promise to hear everything, acknowledge everything, respect everything, and then change what I can.
Yeah, I imagine everyone has felt psychologically unsafe at every point in their career or at home. I imagine, though, like me, before we started researching this topic or discussing this topic, I didn't know what it was called. You just know the feeling, and oftentimes it gets knocked away as, well, this is how we do it when you're a professional, or this is what that should look like, or this is what your hair should look like. Tawana and Phil, then, can you give some examples? I'm assuming we all have them, but I would love to hear yours.
No, and like you said, Adrian, we accept it as normal course of business, right? This is how you act and perform. And when I think about what constitutes a psychologically unsafe workspace that I've experienced, I think it's a bunch of microaggressions that may be intentional or unintentional. Little things that may have cultural bias, right, or comments that may be directed towards somebody from a marginalized culture. And I give this example all the time because when I first started in international business, I heard this, and I know a lot of our audience are in Bermuda and some are not, but if you are in international business in Bermuda, I am sure you have heard this joke. And I used to hear it, and it used to make my flesh crawl, but I never said a word. It took me about 3 or 4 years in international business. It would be inevitably, I'd be at a cocktail party, I would be in a meeting, and somebody would start talking about names, and Bermudian names. And I would always hear, did you hear the one about Latisha, the girl named Latisha? L-R. And then it'd be ha 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 ha, and it would make me cringe. And it took, I guess, maybe being more senior, maybe going into Human Rights Commission and knowing that I had that backing and support behind me to say, look, I've been a school teacher and a probation officer and in the criminal courts, and I have never come across anybody with a name like that or a name similar to that. And have you met this person? Because I haven't. And quite frankly, it's insulting. And that is a joke that is also a microaggression, right? It's attacking one part of somebody's culture, and it can be a naming tradition. Attacking a naming tradition is attacking a culture. And if you hear somebody making a joke about that enough, you start to think, well, dang, my name is Tawana. What are they saying about that name? So that was one instance, and then one specific to me, and I think it was a learning experience for everybody, is that the first panel wasn't here. It's actually when Chubb was ace, but the first panel I ever sat on, it was on the Bermuda Forum, right? And I think I was speaking about, I can't remember what the topic was, but the Bermuda Forum, for people who may not know, is one of our leading forums that we use to write in the Bermuda market. So I was giving a speech on the Bermuda Forum and maybe how some clause operated. And after that, I had two people come up to me, and one person said, "How did you know that?" And I said, well, number one, I'm a lawyer, but number two, it's in the form, and I know what the form says, and I read the red book, and I read the blue book, and of course, if you know the market, you know the books I'm talking about. And then I had the moderator say to me that evening at a cocktail party, "You're really well-spoken." And I said, well, I trained as a barrister. I spent 5 years in court litigating. What did you expect? And he said, well, I didn't mean anything by it. I said, well, how did you think I would sound? Why would I not be well-spoken? And I said, I'm really insulted by that. And he said, well, I didn't mean anything by it. And his wife was there, and he was married to a woman of color. And she said, no, I get it. I get it. It's like when people see my work, and then they see my name, which I won't mention, it's also my middle name, they're like, oh, we didn't think this was you. And he says, no. And she said, yeah. And then it was a learning experience for me, because at the same time, a white Bermudian lawyer overheard the conversation, and he said, I get what you're saying. He said, so often I am the only white Bermudian male in a room full of people who are not Bermudian, and the minute I open my mouth and they hear my accent, I understand that immediately the value of what I have to say goes right down to the bottom. And I'm looking like, wow, because to me, you're really senior, and this is something that you experience as well. And so that, I would say, was the most striking example of really being insulted by somebody telling a lawyer who has had X amount of years litigating experience that they're well-spoken because they can speak on a panel about a policy form.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that, and obviously it impacted you. Like, it's a story you still remember.
Yeah, yeah.
It's distinct. Phil, do you have an example of when you, I'm sure you do, of when you felt psychologically unsafe, and can you explain what it was and how it made you feel, how it may have impacted you?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's important to follow up on what Tawana just mentioned here. From myself as a white male, I have felt that as well, probably with less reason to feel it compared to other people in our industry. But I think it's an important bridge with what we're talking here about. We've all felt this. Yeah. So when you express it or everyone shares it, I can resonate with that, because we've all had that experience, and it's not a comfortable one. And I remember when I moved from my native Belgium to England in London, the red carpet was rolled out for me when I made this transition. But still, when I worked in that environment, I felt like I didn't belong there. I was surrounded by people who were academically incredibly strong, and I felt stronger than me. It's different language, different pace, and I felt I've taken like a step too far. So it was, I was thinking, do I go back? What do I do next? And for me, it took quite a lot of perseverance. I had a lot of support from the people around me to get me through that. But once I realized that I did belong there and I could add value to the whole equation, that was really when I sort of felt comfortable. And at that point in time, I realized that if I made the transition from Belgium to London, what would stop me from going anywhere else? And I think that was a very sort of empowering feeling. And I want to touch upon what Latisha said earlier. I think as an executive, it's incredibly important that our employees can speak their mind and share their feelings. And important in that is that they also feel valued. And not just when they share, it's like, yeah, we've heard you and we move on. no, we've listened to it, we consider it, and we do something with that. And I think that value standpoint is a critical component.
Yeah. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Tawana. Latisha, I don't think that anyone questions why psychological safety is important anymore. But I do want to talk about, and we'll talk about that in a minute, a bit more, but COVID and how psychological safety may impact where the intersections are for race and gender and sexuality. Do marginalized groups, are they impacted more when issues of psychological safety are concerned? And how has COVID impacted everything?
So it's funny. Amy Edmondson has this quote that I really have sat with the last 2 years, where she said, everybody's on the boat, but some of us are on the Lido deck and some of us are in the engine room. And so we have to recognize that not everyone has gotten through COVID the same way over the last 2 years. You know, I've heard especially a lot more women talking about, can I stay in this environment if my kids are going to be home? I've heard a lot more people of color talking about, you know, I don't know if I want to go back where the microaggressions live, when actually in my house I felt more safe than I have in years. I've heard people talk about even the difference between work from home and working in the office and who gets access to that. You know, there are some places where it's a blanket policy for all. There are some where the manager makes the call. But if you don't feel safe with your manager, you're not going to have that conversation. And so one of the things that I've talked to people about a lot of the last 2 years is we've talked about making sure that we're talking about mental health. We're talking about making sure that, you know, physical safety, sanitization, washing hands is important. But do people feel emotionally, psychologically safe to return? Do people feel like they're going to have to put their armor back on to walk into the building? And so when we're telling people it's time to come back, one of the things that hopefully was important when people were thinking about this from a management perspective is, are we creating an environment that people want to come back to? Are we creating an environment right now that people feel safe to return to, safe to work in, safe to return and say, actually, I add value here? You know, and so that's an important part. COVID just exposed where the cracks already were. And so I often say, COVID wasn't the issue. All it did is show us where the issues lay. And managers at that point could say to themselves, hold on, how am I determined to fix this? Or even how am I determined to deliberately notice this? Because willful blindness in the workplace is a real thing. And so it's really important to us that we look at things and say, what am I prepared to do? That's what psychological safety is. I'm going to notice things when they're brought to my attention. I'm going to notice things even if it's not brought to my attention. I'm going to create environments where I am constantly gate checking that people are okay here. I'm not waiting for someone to come and say, I'm not safe. I'm creating a space that checks in and says, are you safe today? Are you safe today? Are you safe today? Because psychological safety is something that can either be maintained or lost by one conversation. By one misstep. And so we collectively have that responsibility to not have a moment like this and have a forum and then never talk about this again, but instead be doing the constant work of saying, hey, how are we intentionally, again and again and again, choosing to be safe for people?
Yeah, thank you. That actually made my segue into the next topic really easy. Talking about why it's important at work and what we can do about it. I'd like to really get into how each of your experiences can shine a light on what we can all do at our own workplaces. Tawana is a peer ally, Phil is the leader of a company, and then Latisha, I'd love to come back to you to talk about what happens when you don't have peer support, when you don't have a psychologically safe tone from the top. If that's all right. So Tawana, can you start sharing what allyship is, what microcultures look like?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, there's a problematic definition of allyship that I don't know if I subscribe to, but it's when one party uses their privilege to assist or help a marginalized group or person. And I think when we say that we are disempowering people who may feel like, look, I don't have that type of privilege, and so I don't think it's necessary. I think an ally is somebody who realizes that there is a marginalized group or population, and they decide to help this group or population in some way, and I'll go into some of the steps you can use to do that. But I'll reflect back on my own experience and something I said at the top of the panel when I spoke about Sarah, so I hope she doesn't get embarrassed. But when I transitioned into insurance, I was a criminal lawyer at 35 years of age, and I got rejected from so many jobs. And so when I finally got an interview in front of Sarah, we had a conversation. We had an honest conversation about what this would look like, about this transition. And I often say to Sarah, you took a chance that not many would take on a 35-year-old criminal lawyer. And that is allyship, right? That is somebody using, it's not their privilege, but using their position to say, hey, look, I'm going to go beyond stereotypes. And what I will do is say, you may not get the job, you might get the job, but at least give you a shot, where a lot of people wouldn't be willing to do that. And that's, to me, an example of how somebody can be an ally in their everyday role. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to participate on a panel, you don't have to participate in any type of drive or volunteer initiative. In your everyday role, you can look and say, is there a sector of the population who are underrepresented? Is there somebody who is not being heard or not getting this advantage? And what will I do about that? And pretty much also the same, I won't go into detail, but the same with Natalie as well. You know, they are both people who I know have said, I am going to use the position that I have to make sure that I can help give people an equal chance and shot in this industry. And so those are ways of being allies in your everyday role. If you want it to be something that you look and you identify that there's an issue, I would say educate yourself. And also the one thing for allyship that is a detriment is when you make decisions for a population or people and they are not in the room. Nobody should be deciding what the LGBTQ community needs and they have not spoken to you out. You don't make those decisions for people because what you're doing is you're running roughshod over their thoughts, feelings, needs, and that doesn't do anybody out any good. And the other thing I always say, and if I had to leave the audience with anything about allyship, it would be do not get caught up on intent. You need to focus on the impact, because you could have the best of intentions, but don't become a martyr. Don't say, well, I meant to, and it's not my fault that they didn't appreciate that what we were trying to do for Black History Month was, no, right? If somebody says to you, what happened, this is how what you did made me feel, then you need to go back to the drawing board. So focus on impact and not intent when you decide that this is something, there is an issue that you think needs to be addressed or you want to help assist on.
Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah.
I want to, because I used a word earlier, and I want to make sure the audience is, we think about them differently. Like when you talk about intent versus impact, I absolutely agree. The phrase that jumps to mind is about us, without us.
Oh yeah,
Is
that's
we
a
use
good
that all
one.
the time. Like,
Yeah.
oh, really? They made a decision about the gay community.
Yes.
They didn't ask anybody. Oh,
Yeah.
they made a decision about us, without us.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or when you think about other topics, when you look at
Yeah.
who's in the room making the decisions.
That's
like, oh,
it.
okay, yeah. But I used the word intentionality earlier, and I want to just make sure we're talking about two different things. Intentionality is obviously being very thoughtful and
Yeah.
purposeful when you're
Yeah.
making decisions about what your intent is supposed to be, and measuring the impact as well. In terms of like microcultures, and you said that you don't want anybody in the audience to feel like they are caught out, or they can't be an ally because they don't feel like they have privilege. I think you gave really good examples, but even in that instance, the people you're talking about had positions which you might consider is a privilege. They're in the industry already.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are there what other ways can you be an ally day to day? Just for your colleague, and actually I want to put you on the spot. Do you think people have a responsibility to be an ally? I believe I have a responsibility to be an ally,
Yeah.
but I'm probably not everybody shares that. What is your experience
Yeah,
there?
so to answer your first question, I think that and you're right, people do have positions in which they can make some decisions, but I think also it can be as simple as going back to one of my early examples, and if you're in the room and somebody is making a culturally inappropriate joke, you can say, hey, Adrian, that's not on, right? That it's simple as that.
Yep.
Right? As simple as that. And people often listen to peers that look like them, right? So if somebody says, and actually, great example of this, I was on a WhatsApp chat group, right? And somebody made an inappropriate joke. And one of the people came on the chat group and said, hey, I don't know if you know this, but, and so I'm not here for that. I'm not here for that.
Yep.
Right? And everybody was like, oh, snap. But we respected it, and that was the end of that. And that wasn't, this was a level playing field. And somebody just said, hey, I'm not comfortable with this, right? And I don't think that this is something that we should do. The other thing is, too, is that we can include people. Every time you make a decision or a choice to have a bite to eat or to go get a cup of coffee, right? That is a chance to include somebody, even if you're not giving that person a job, right? Even if you're not hiring that person, you could be junior to that person and note that when I walk by Phil, he is always at his desk. And what is it? Any surprise he's the only Belgian? No. So that's, so whatever the case might, there are little things every day that you can do. You can make the decision to be inclusive. Now, I don't want to put that responsibility on anybody, because what we often do, and maybe it's because as a Black woman, I often feel that we are looked at to solve our problems, right? Tell us what you need for us to do, and then I don't really want to put that responsibility on anybody, because you never know what issues people are presenting with, right?
That's right.
I don't care if somebody looks like a straight white male, right? You don't know what they're presenting with, so I wouldn't want to put that on the person. It has to be, you have to speak according to your conscience. I don't think it's I think, no, ironically, I think I have a responsibility, right? But that's because I think I've cultivated a voice in this space, and I'll be really frank and transparent. I had a discussion with Department of Immigration about international businesses hiring practice maybe a year ago. And the immigration investigation officer said to me, I wish you had reported this anonymously. And I said, why? I said, I did not work as hard to build up a voice to talk about discrimination, to report things anonymously. And at the end of the day, if I get backlash, I'll go back to court, right? I will hang out a shingle and I will take my books and go to court. And when I spoke to the head of that company, their response was, we wish that you had been anonymous because I may not be able to protect you. It's your company. But I didn't work that hard. So while I don't feel that everybody has a responsibility, I know that you have to think about what you want and what you value personally. And personally, I do feel a responsibility. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to hit that. Personally, I do feel a responsibility. But also, you're absolutely right. It doesn't have to be a grand gesture of opening the door into the industry for somebody. It could be as simple as this type of joke, this type of language is inappropriate. Or, for instance, if we're having a work function and we know that it is on a Friday night, but we have 5 employees that are Seventh-day Adventists, maybe if you're on the planning committee, maybe you say, hey, could it be earlier in the afternoon? Why does it have to be a Friday evening? Or could it be on a Thursday? And that's you, Joe Blow, planning committee. So those are the types of things that you can do.
Yeah, thank you. I love the concept of not being a responsibility, but I think we've been able to show people that there are plenty of ways you can be an ally without taking on a huge, you don't have to have a position, you don't have to be straight white man to be an ally. You can be an ally all over the place. But you and I both know there's only so much that we can do on allyship and across the board. A lot of the stuff is above our pay grade, and so Phil, I'd love to talk to you about what this looks like for you, your experience, and how you feel like you show up as an ally, but in your responsibility as a leader of a company.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's definitely something I personally have grown into over time, and I think it is part of my responsibility to, assist and move society forward. I've been in Bermuda 16 years now, PRC, BOTC. This is now my home, this is my family's home, and I want to invest, my time into Bermuda. And, as a business at Fidelis, we have set ourselves the goal that by 2028, we want to have our office represent what the demographic of Bermuda looks like. So it's, we're working towards that. It's a lot of challenges that come with that, but pleased to say we have sort of different levels of employment within the business, and so the junior professional level, we are there, and now we need to sort of bring that through all the way into the organization. But we've set ourselves very specific tasks. I must say, as a business, this is a Bermuda specific one, but we have that for all of our other offices in the group as well, in London and in Ireland, and we are very supported by our senior leadership who are really driving that. And for me, that's very strong encouragement to go all the way on this. And then it is just creating that psychologically safe space for everyone to come into. And one of the practices that we've adopted is, around our HR interview process. We want to have 2 people there from our company, mixed gender, mixed ethnicity. So whoever sits on the other side of the table, feels like, okay, well, this looks like a place where I could belong to, and it changes the dynamic of that interview process immediately. And yeah, we've definitely have seen the benefit of that. And I'm a big proponent of making sure the employees we have here, which is a combination of locals and expats, that they understand Bermuda's culture. And we've been really working with a couple charitable organizations on Ireland just to integrate them more, because we all want to learn, and if you learn how a society operates, it's easier for us to imagine what we need to do to be more inclusive, as an employer. But I think firstly, and this is one thing that ABIC and ABIR have helped me greatly with as an executive here, is to look at numbers. We look at numbers every day, and you can clearly see that there's a massive gap in ethnicity and gender representation at the executive senior levels on this island. We need to do something about that. So then we put a tangible plan in place, which we're working towards. We've had that plan tested and vetted by some of the organizations on Ireland, including ACRE, and whose panel I'm speaking tomorrow. And it's great to have that, back and forth dynamic, and that's the only way we're going to end up with results here. But that's, as an executive, we're really driven by results. And when we set ourselves the goals for 2028, my remit was what process steps am I going to put in place to hit that for 2028?
That's great. I mean, the data shows it. These initiatives are phenomenal at Fidelis. A McKinsey quarterly report recently showed that 98% of respondents believe that it's the responsibility of business leaders to create a safe and respectful workplace. So it's pretty clear. I think that the data was 89% of them thought it was paramount, and then 8% maths, 9% in between. Maybe it was 88 and another 9 or something, where thought it was important but not paramount. Phil, I know you have an example of a recent Fidelis meeting where you felt maybe the tone that you used at the meeting changed the outcome. So I'd love for you to talk about that.
Yeah, sure. I think, and I might be speaking for fellow executives here, we often want to provide people the forum to express their opinions, and often when you do that, not much is coming back. And then you can sit there and say, is it because people don't want to, or is it because they don't feel comfortable, or because I've not created that environment? And often when we solicit for opinions or thoughts, it goes pretty quiet. We had a meeting recently where we did, a collective excursion with our Bermuda D&I committee, and we visited a charity, and then we sat back in the office and talked about that visit and how we felt. And this was, everyone in the room was speaking, it was a free-flowing conversation, and I sort of sat there and thought, what is different in this meeting from all the previous meetings? Was it how I showed up? Was it how I asked the question? Or was it because I included everyone in this excursion to that charity that created that environment? So reflecting on that is really the inclusion component, where the people clearly in that room felt they were part of the experience and in a safe space to talk about it. So, it was a mental note to myself to replicate and create that environment more often.
Yeah.
So you think it was showing up, or you think it was your attitude? What did you narrow it down to, like some of the key ingredients that made the difference?
I think I left the floor open for people to share their opinion,
Okay. Yeah.
more than I would normally do.
Yeah.
And I think as an executive, you know, it's sad to say, but there's often a time element to it where you say, okay, we've got 15 minutes here. This is what we want to get out of the meeting, so we're rushing through it, and you put your agenda at the front. But then you end up with something that, you know, hasn't really achieved what you wanted out of that meeting. So that 15 minutes is really wasted.
Yeah.
It's better for everyone else to share their opinion. And yeah, I thought it was a very constructive session.
Yeah. I definitely put psychological safety in the DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. I definitely put, I mean, psychological safety covers all of it, but I find it always hits equity for me a lot of the time. Equity is always the one that's hardest. It costs the most, it takes the most time, it's the most intentional, and you have to be more thoughtful of the impact as well. And one of the other ways that leadership has shown up in other areas are policies, procedures, how we look at resumes. Are those things that you're thinking about as well, and you think other leaders should as well?
Yeah, I think, yeah, we definitely are, how we look at that and using blind resumes for that. I do feel when talking to other executives in Ireland that there is, you know, broad support for this. The difference is just putting that into action, as we talked about earlier, not just the intention, action, deliverables at the end of it. And I think, you know, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in the end. Once you start doing it, it's like a snowball that starts going downhill, and it gathers momentum.
I think once you create a culture with DEI embedded in it, which then, if we believe that DEI initiatives then lead us to places that are more psychologically safe, having these DEI initiatives that you can do yourself, your allies, as an ally, leadership can do from the top, you know, intentional, deliberate creation, and putting in DEI measurement tools, so target measuring, like as part of your performance review. Having, you know, you must do some, you have to be good at communication, you have to collaborate, you have to do all the other things, you have to do your goals, and then you also have to build in DEI. I mean, that's something that is definitely something that can be created from the top.
Yeah, I want to pick on that point, Adrian, you just mentioned. I think I would avoid, you know, the word must do it.
Oh, yeah.
We want to encourage people
Yes.
and reward them for if they do it voluntarily. And I think, you know, that's a critical component there. There's a lot of people that do way beyond their day job.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I mean, so I have a couple of things. Remind me about the DEI trap. I'm going to come back to that. But just to talk about allyship, and also I know that this is an ABER-sponsored panel, but since Phil and I are both also on ABIC, I would just like to say that one of the things that you can do, we just had an interview process, a really long one, and we used the blind resume process. And the reason why we thought as ABIC it was important for us to, when we were doing this recruitment for this senior role, to use the blind resume process is because we want to encourage our member companies to do so as well. And in order to encourage our member companies to do so, we had to lead by example. And so we've done this now, and it's saying, and you know, we are able to say, hey, it did not increase our cost by X amount, or perhaps it, you know, or if it was beneficial in this way. So, I mean, that's another way that you can really be an ally and trying to support is actually leading by example. And so the other thing was when Phil said about the, we want to avoid the must, I think he's absolutely right, because what we often find is that, you know, and I know everybody's heard this, women become the caretakers of the office, right? There's an office function, it's a woman planning the menu. We have community day, it's the woman doing the community, leading the community volunteer initiative, right? And it becomes this way in which we say, no, women are visible, look. And then the DEI panel and participation, right? That's another way to say, oh, no, we value our marginalized populations because look, they get to speak on these panels. So we have to be really careful that when we start saying you must do this, we have to. It's nothing wrong with saying that you have to uphold company culture, but if people are going to do DEI work, and I know that this is going to be controversial, but I firmly believe that if people are going to do DEI work during their day job, then that should be something that they are appreciated for and valued in the workspace by the manager. It should not be you're asking for time off to do this. No, it should be that as a part of an ambassador for this company, and because this is this company's value, we want you to do this during the workday, and when we look at your performance, this is something that we factor into in terms of how we value as a colleague and employee.
Yeah.
Because far too often, it's people will ask for time off to go to dive in, and it's literally time off to go to dive in. Well, no, this is about inclusion in insurance, right? You should get credit for attending and participating in something to make our community that we're in, IB, better, right? Because inclusive and diverse workforces have been shown to be more productive, more fast forward in thinking, and able, and I mean, gracious now with, the younger generation, really, that's really how you attract keen, progressive workers. So that's my piece about DEI not being appreciated in terms of when you evaluate it, but I agree it should not be a must.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I sit a bit on the other side of must, I think.
Yeah.
We've talked about how we can be an ally at your peer level. We've talked about how leaders can create psychologically safe workspaces. But there are countless people out there who probably work in places that, or in teams or in microcultures where they may not have a peer ally, or leadership is not, the initiatives they're doing are not, they might have the right intent, but they're not coming through with the right impact. Latisha, this is right in your wheelhouse. How do people, give us some tips on what people can do day to day to psychologically protect themselves in psychologically not safe workplaces?
Thanks for asking that, because I think sometimes we act as if it's not a real thing. And we've all worked in spaces, unfortunately, where we haven't felt safe. And so I always go back to something my dad said years ago to me, which is, you always have the ability to vote with your feet. And what I mean by that is, we have always a choice on whether we stay in environments that don't celebrate us. And so that's obviously the last course we can take, but I always want to put that out there as a reminder that for organizations, as you see your people vote with your feet, that's a reminder for us, something in this culture isn't serving them. So we also have to remember that we, as the people working for an organization, have the ability to say, this is not what works for me.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, if you choose to stay, we also have to remember we all have our circles of influence. I've worked in environments where maybe, the tone from the top wasn't the best, but in my circle, I could say, I'm gonna be a safe space for someone. I'm gonna create that, I'm gonna nurture that. I remember being in an environment where there was a very tense environment, and I remember someone coming into my office one day and saying, I'm so grateful you're a place where I can talk. I'm so grateful you're a person where I know things stay with you. I'm so grateful you're a person where I can just kind of unburden myself. So it doesn't matter what the organization is doing, we have our own abilities to protect ourselves. Making safety for ourselves is critical, whether that's, hopefully going to somewhere like an EAP and saying, hey, I need to talk this through. As I say, one of the things we do at EAP is management consultations, and I find often managers will reach out and say, hey, I'd like to make things safe for people, but I don't feel safe as a manager. I can't create what doesn't feel real for me. So one of the things I find so critical is the more we own making our own self safe, the more we're available to do that. When you use that point of, how can I be an ally if I don't have privilege? How can I create safety when I'm not safe?
Mm-hmm.
So if nothing else, I want everyone to walk away with the mindset that we are not responsible necessarily for the whole company, we're responsible for us. And one of the things that is very critical is making sure that we are in a headspace where then we can notice, we can do, we can get involved, but that requires us to be safe.
Mm-hmm.
And so whether that's using a life coach, whether that's going for therapy, whether that's saying, hey, I'm gonna set up, a committee within this organization, whether it's creating, I was working with an organization where they've created a safe spot committee, which I thought was interesting. They're just like, we recognize we're going through a lot. We're going through a lot of transitions. People aren't happy. And so we just want to create some people, some places. We're not going to call them allies because that feels like work. We're going to create safe spots in this environment. And people had to self-nominate, which is very different than when we're like, Tawana feels safe for everybody. No, people can say, hey, I'm volunteering to say, I'm going to show up for people in that way. But also going back to your point, which they did quite lovely, is they then said, and we're going to create room and space for people to do it. It's not going to be an add-on to your JD. It's not going to be just one more any other task. It's something that we're saying we're celebrating as an organization, so we're going to put some action behind it. So for all these companies that are listening today, what we really want for all of you is to figure out what's the next step, what's the action. Even if it's as simple as checking yourself, do I create safety? It's a very simple but loaded question. Do I create safety for the people around me, for the people I interact with, for this organization?
I mean, I think that's powerful. Do I create safety? And it's something I think I'll continue to ask myself. But I do want to challenge you a little bit on the voting with your feet. Because with the cost of living and everything else, you know that there are so many people who do not feel safe and or valued, but also feel stuck. So that's why I really appreciate when you said, you know, it could be EAP, right? But is EAP free of charge? I don't know.
So
this is not an advertisement. I genuinely don't know.
for our member companies, yes.
Okay, for member companies. Because there are some people who feel like I can't afford therapy.
Yep.
I also can't afford to not pay my rent.
Yep.
So I feel stuck. And then the only other thing I would say is that I know it's difficult if you have a company in which you don't feel safe, but always be mindful of any bullying and harassment policies that you have in your company. And like I said, again, it's difficult if you don't think that that's going to be trusted or they're trustworthy. But explore all of your options, including those external. But yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Well, I know I've learned a whole heck of a lot today, and in prepping for this panel with you guys, if you can give just what we promised was real-life examples, things people can take away really quickly. Can you each give like one example of what you'd want an audience member to take away? One quick soundbite. It's hard to wrap it up.
Yeah, so what I would encourage those people who feel like they've fallen into the DEI activist trap, right, and get shuttled into these roles in their company. The next time you have a performance review and the next time you discuss this with your manager, if this is something that your company is supportive of you doing, I would suggest that you try to draft up a job descriptor in which this is one of the tasks that you are evaluated with, if this is something that you decide you want to do. Because in that way, it can add, it helps them understand the value that you're adding when you engage in these, and you don't feel engage in these events, and you don't feel taken advantage of.
Absolutely, Phil.
I think, you know, as an executive, our employees are our biggest asset, as I said at the start, and if we can provide an environment for them that is psychologically safe and they feel valued, you know, employees become growth engines of the business.
I love that, growth engines. Oh. My thing is, often we're talking about the tone from the top. One of the things I want people to walk away from is actually your own personal tone. So actually, psychological safety is about looking down and looking across. So regardless of what's coming up from above, you're saying, this is how I can influence someone junior, that coffee. This is how I can influence the people around me, that space of safety. And so I want all of us to walk away knowing that psychological safety is intentional work, it's deliberate work, it's sometimes messy work, but it's critical for a business, because the more people feel safe, the better they are, the better they show up, the more they have to give. And at this point, the business case for it is sound, because the better we are, the more the company, you know, takes advantage of that. But it's so critical that we really take this seriously nowadays.
Thanks so much to the three of you. And I just, in wrapping up, I do want to say that I've learned a lot. I know you've learned a lot. I hope everyone out there watching has taken something away from here, whether it's seeing your own experience or learning something that you can take away back to your own workplace, either for you or as an ally. We just want you to be inspired to create braver cultures back where you work. And I just want, again, thanks again to Latisha, Phil, and Tawana, to our sponsors, AB or Aon, and Markel, and last but not least, the Dive-In Festival for putting on this session today. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. You did a fantastic job. Thank you.
Thank you.